The girl may have been the end for him. The end's beginning like the bend of a road too slight to notice where it leads. She could have happened to him a day later or a day before, but she was there on that day, in that moment, just hours after Circus Palmer turned 40, a predictable time for a certain kind of end to come, and just seconds after Maggie slid her hand from his wrist, and with her lips parted just enough to slip his finger through if he'd wanted, whispered, "I have something to tell you."
Welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host, Lynne Thompson. Join me for engaging conversations with writers who live or work or invoke the city of Los Angeles in their writing. Today, I'm happy to have the opportunity to speak with Laura Warrell. Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm, Laura Warrell's debut novel featuring a cast of women of all ages and backgrounds who become entangled with a freedom-loving jazz musician. At its heart, a book about love. Born in New York, raised in Ohio, Laura now calls Los Angeles home. But the road to Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm was quite the journey. Welcome, Laura. It's so good to see you.
I'm so excited to see you. I always love seeing you.
Well, thank you so much, and it's good to have you as a guest on Turn the Page, particularly as Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm has just come out in paperback.
It has, yes.
And I've been thinking about whether the feeling about that is different than when it first came out last year in hardback, which is wonderful, of course, and we're going to talk about all your accolades, but is it a different feeling with the paperback?
You know, it's interesting. They're like children.
Yes.
You know, I know that people don't always like to hear artists talk about their productions as children, but it really feels that way in some ways. I was in love with the first book, particularly the cover.
Yes.
It's a really beautiful cover. And then when we talked about the cover for the second book, or the paperback, I never felt about it the way I did the first, but eventually I warmed up to it, and now I love both of my babies just as much. And I'm excited to have another sort of moment to talk about the book and the characters, because I love them. They are really my children.
And the book has gotten so many accolades, from NPR to the New York Times. I think you were a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Discover Prize, for the Penn Faulkner Writing Fiction Award.
Yeah.
So it's gotten plenty of exposure, and will only get more with the paperback. But for those 5 people in our audience that haven't read it, could you give us just a short synopsis of the book?
Sure. So Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm is about the women in a Playboy jazz musician's life. So we have Circus Palmer, who is a trumpet player. He's about to turn 40 in the first chapter of the book, or he has just turned 40 in the first chapter of the book. And he can't be tied down. He's got a career to follow, he's got dreams, he's got a wild streak. But in the first chapter, the woman who's kind of closest to his heart tells him she's pregnant, and he doesn't love hearing that news. So he abandons her. And over the course of the novel, we meet the other women in his life. So he's kind of escaping that responsibility, or at least shirking it for now, to reconnect with the other women in his life, or new women. So we've got his daughter, who's about 14 years old. We've got an ex-wife who's still carrying a torch. We've got a woman he meets in a bar. We've got a woman he hasn't called for a few months that he's suddenly reemerging with. But the tables turn. So the focus is on the women. We meet him in the first chapter, but in the subsequent chapters, we learn about those women from their perspective, the stories from their perspectives. So it's about them, what's going on in their lives, and what that relationship is like from their perspective, because we often read about womanizers, Don Juans, Lotharios, but I wanted to tell the story from the other side, the women's perspective. So that's what I do in the book.
Well, and I think that was so brilliantly rendered, and I heard you speak at the North Figueroa Bookshop here in Los Angeles, and one of the things you said really stuck out to me, and that was that it was important for readers to have books about women written by women. Maybe you could expound a little bit about why
Sure.
that was so, why you believe that's to be the case.
You know, it's interesting. I've only told this story one other time, but I think it kind of makes the point. I wrote an essay about something that had happened in my marriage. I was married, divorced now, and it was a challenge in that relationship and something that my husband and I, at the time, didn't really reach understanding about, but it's something that happens a lot. There was a woman that he was looking at a little too much, and it was really hurting, and he never really got that. So I wrote an essay about it. It was published in the Rumpus, and I read it actually here in Los Angeles. And a man came up to me afterward, and he said, "I get it now." And to me, the importance of telling stories from the perspectives of communities we don't hear from, whether it's women, whether it's people of color, whether it's members of the LGBTQ community, is these are our stories, and this is what you're not seeing about our stories and our lives and our experiences and our communities and the world we live in. And that's why I think it's so important to, for women to, and everyone from any kind of marginalized communities to tell their stories, because it's not just here's what we're experiencing on the side.
Right.
When you're in a relationship with someone, there are two people involved, and whatever the man is experiencing in the case of a book like this is not the only story.
Exactly.
Is not the only reality of the relationship, and not the only emotional experience that's important.
Exactly.
And that's why I wanted to tell this book, or write this book. And as I said, we have so many stories going back for centuries about these kinds of male characters. And I thought, I have never really heard about how the women are impacted.
And
So
what's
that's
so
part of the reason.
wonderful is not only do you render them beautifully, and I think that is at the heart of the success of the book, but you're also very fair to who he is and who he isn't,
Right,
his
right.
good side, his bad side, etc. So that was very successfully done. I was thinking, though, with the women that you have in the book, whether there was any one particular one that you identified more with than the others, and if so, did that make it harder or easier to write about?
You know, it's interesting. There are about 9 women in the book. And as I said, you've got a woman who's a bartender, and she's 27 years old, and she's having a fun life. And then you've got a woman who's a dancer, and she's very dramatic and self-contained. And I really invented all of them. There really aren't any women that I felt were me, though for sure I'm in all of them, and I'm in Circus. I understand him as well. But I did have a moment where I was writing his daughter. She figures in heavily. There are women in the book who only have one chapter. They come and they go, just like they do in Circus's life. And then there are women who we spend a little bit more time with, and one of them is his daughter. And I don't remember what I was doing to her in that chapter. She's got about 3 chapters. But I just had this moment where I was so sad, and I realized, am I Coco?
Yes.
And I'm not.
Right.
So if
right.
you read the book,
Right.
I am not Coco. That is not my life. But I think that I can relate to a young girl who is full of hormones and full of energy and full of life and trying to figure out who she is in the world and not having a lot of guidance. Circus is not around. Right. The women that he is interested in, Coco's trying to understand herself through
Right.
those women. Her mother, Pia, is not very present in her life. She does a lot of caretaking with her, so she's kind of on her own.
Right.
And even though Coco's 14 and growing up at a time that's different than when I was a girl, Coco is mixed race. Yes. That is part of her challenge in trying to form that identity and have a solid sense of self. So I would say, yeah, I discovered, didn't intend, but I discovered that, yeah, maybe I'm closest to Coco.
And it was interesting to me in terms of her being mixed race. One of the things I thought was really impressive, and perhaps in this time that we're living in, the issue of race is done with such a light touch
Yes.
throughout the book. It's not in your face, but it's not absent.
Right.
And I wondered, was this something that you intended from the beginning, or did it kind of manifest itself as you continued in the writing process?
In a lot of ways, it's kind of intentional, I would say. I'm working on my second book now. Race factors into the story, but it's not primary to the story. But like any situation in life, it's going to play a role. And so for me, readers or writers that I admire, there's one writer in particular who I kind of studied. Her name is Susan Choi. She wrote a book called American Woman, and the main character is an Asian American woman, and the story is not about race. It's a woman who is actually following Patty Hearst and hiding Patty Hearst. But there were moments where the character is confronting race in some way, right? That someone says something to her, or there's a microaggression, or somebody makes some offhanded comment, and she deals with it, responds, and then moves on in the story. And so I wanted to do the same thing.
A similar
thing here.
Sort of
so there's a
light touch.
scene, for example, where Coco is, like I said, she's mixed race, and she's with her mother who's blonde, and her cousin and her aunt who are blonde, and she's recognizing, I don't look like them, and that means something. Right. And then she moves on with the day. And that's how I have decided to approach it. And it just feels more comfortable to me because it feels more like how life is. It's not that when something happens, it implodes the whole day. Well, sometimes it does.
Yes.
But addressing it the way you would in life.
It's very deftly done. So we focused on the women a little bit, but I'm also thinking about Circus Palmer, and I know the answer to this, but I want our audience to know you're very specifically celebrating him as a musician. He could have been a painter, he could have been an architect, he could have been a movie director, anything else, but making him a musician was important to this story. Mm-hmm. And talk to us a little bit about why that was.
I love this question, and there are so many reasons. I'll start unpacking them. The first one is, I feel like everyone can relate to the attraction of musicians. I think, for sure, artists in general are really attractive because very often they seem to, exist in life in a way the rest of us don't, or they have access to some kind of internal, emotional, depth that we find sexy and attractive. But I think particularly with musicians, that happens. And I think regardless of the kind of music you like, I mean, I know people who are fascinated by country musicians or rock or hip hop or all types of musicians. I think that that's something that's kind of universal. And I chose jazz for a variety of reasons. One is because it's a really intricate, complex type of music that really requires a level of dedication and focus and study that can easily kind of take up a lot of space in the musician's life. It's also a genre of music that a lot of people think is dead. In fact, while I was writing the book, while I was promoting the book, people have asked me, when does it take place? Because they think jazz, well, that's the 30s or 40s or 50s, right? That's not right now. So I liked the idea that you have this character, very attractive character to women, who is prioritizing a musical genre that a lot of people in the world kind of think, is anybody even playing that or listening to that anymore? And then I liked playing around with the idea of whether or not the women actually like the music.
Yes.
So they're drawn to him because he's sexy and he's intense and he's got a trumpet and he's very big and charismatic, but when they listen to the music, some of them kind of think, do I actually like this?
Yes.
And so what does that mean for their relationship? How does that shape the relationship when the most important thing to him is the music? And then I think the last thing is that the music of jazz kind of mirrors how I wanted to structure the book. Like a jazz piece where every player is coming forward to take the solo, play his or her rendition of the melody. Each woman is stepping forward and playing the melody of Circus Palmer, right? This is who this guy is to me. This is what this relationship means to me. This is what it's doing to me. And she gets a chapter to express that. So similar to how jazz
I
plays.
love that idea, and as I'm listening to you talk about it, it makes me wonder, and I do this sometimes as a poet. I am not a novelist. 40 lines, you're
And
in,
I
you're
am
out,
not a
you're
poet.
done.
I don't
So,
know how you do what you do.
Very different. But I wonder, did you do a architectural structure, for lack of a better term, before the writing or at different points in the writing, just structurally how it looked, given that you were tracking a jazz form?
Right.
It was very interesting to hear you talk about it in that way and say, I want the structure of the book to follow that. What was your process?
You know, it's interesting. Originally, the idea was just to have one-off chapters with women. In fact, it was originally a short story collection. So none of the women were going to return.
Right.
And so I knew that I had to have an arc for Circus, right? We don't want to just have him come in and out of women's lives and that's it. He needed to be on his own journey, having a conflict in his life that he needed to resolve, right? We need that in fiction. Right. So I figured, what do I need to do to him to sort of set him off? What would be the worst thing that could happen to him? And this was Maggie telling him that she's pregnant. And so then the way it kind of played out, and it's interesting, people have asked me about the structure. I didn't do any outlining. I didn't have posties on my wall. It just kind of came to me. And then I did some rearranging. So more of what I did was think about the women. What kind of stories do I want these women to tell? What kind of women do I want to present? For example, Maggie, the woman who's pregnant, she's dynamic. She doesn't need him. She's that sort of version of a woman involved with a guy like this. And then you've got the woman who is really pining, Josephine. And then kind of everyone in between. So how can his arc be helped, right, by the individual arcs of the women? So I kind of wrote their stories individually,
right,
and then kind of figured out how to piece them together. So we felt like there was an arc for the women, right? That the women are evolving sort of as a communal force,
right,
and at the same time, their evolution is somehow shaping his arc as well.
Exactly.
So it was less about planning beforehand. I improvised, to use a jazz term.
To use a jazz term. And it's like seeing a beautiful building, and you know there was some structure to it, and yet it's so organic that you're not actually seeing the structure, but you, in the back of your mind, you're thinking, yeah, but it has a structure.
Yes.
So I thought that was brilliant, as well as, and this doesn't happen often, I don't believe, your publisher was smart enough to say, let's come up with a playlist. Yes? That was the publisher's idea, or was it a mutual?
That was the publisher's idea.
Talk
they
about
really
that.
got
How
behind.
did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, I anytime I can, I want to give a shout out to my publisher. My publisher is Pantheon. My editor is Lisa Lucas. Deb Garrison actually helped edit the book itself. And then I have a great team of publicists, and they've been doing amazing things. I have been so grateful for how much they've gotten behind this book. And one of their ideas one of Lisa's ideas actually was to create a record. She hired musicians to write an original song, so that's what that is here. And then the playlist was, originally we were going to do a jazz playlist.
Right.
And I was excited about that. But then I told the publicist, I actually have songs that I listened to when I was writing each woman's chapter. I know even the book that I'm working on now has nothing to do with music, but I have playlists for the characters because it helps me get into their character. And so I said maybe we could put a playlist together of the music that the women like and that sort of embodies them. So there's a playlist on Spotify. If you Google or input Sweet Soft Plenty Rhythm, you'll find it, and it's got Beyonce's on it, Rihanna is on it, there's a Lorde song. I had to do a little bit more work for Coco because she's 14. I was like, what are the kids listening to? But that was really fun, and people who've read the book have come to me and tried to figure out which song goes with which woman, and very often They're correct.
They're correct. Well, it just adds a richness to the reading to go back and listen to and say, oh, of course that would be Maggie's, and of course that would be Josephine's.
Right.
So I think it was so richly textured, and I'm glad that we can tell our audience where they can go to find it if they want to heighten the experience of reading the book.
Fun.
And with the music, you're not a musician yourself, and so was there a lot of research involved, and how did that come into being? Because people often think in a novel, well, maybe there's no research, but in this case, and in many cases, there is a lot of research.
There's a lot of research in novels. I think people don't realize, and I think part of it is I know writers, aspiring writers, who don't realize how much research goes into to writing a novel. I mean, if you're writing about someone who's a doctor and you're not a doctor, you got to do research, right? So I'm not a musician. I did play. My mom made me take piano lessons and told me I'm going to regret it if I didn't practice, and she was right. So I knew enough about music to know where to go to start doing the research. So I read several books by a guy named Nat Hentoff. And what I loved about them is that these books, I did other, research about jazz and reading books and histories of jazz and watching documentaries about it. But what I liked about Hentoff's books were they included quotes directly from musicians. So not only could I sort of hear the cadence of the way they spoke and how they thought and how they, communicated, but you were getting their stories.
Exactly.
Right? And so I could feel the clubs they played in. I understood where the ideas for music came from. I got something from one of them where they were talking about it, if you'd had a fight with your wife that night or somebody walked by in the club, your sound was going to be different. So having that kind of information was incredibly helpful to build the character and know how the two musicians, Maggie's also a musician, she's a drummer, as you know, how their lives and their craft as musicians sort of came through. I was also teaching at the Berklee College of Music at the time. I was living in Boston, where the book takes place. And I would ask my students, I would say, so when you do X, Y, Z, what happens? What's it feel like? And I got a lot from them. And then, for example, I met a drummer through a friend and said, can I just buy you lunch and you just play drums for a couple of hours and I ask you questions? And so I would ask, what does it feel like in your hands?
Exactly.
What's happening in your mind? Do you hear the other instruments?
Exactly. Oh, that's great.
It was really fun. And as a novelist, I like doing that. Yes. Part of the reason we write is to discover other worlds and other people. And so I did a lot of research, and I had an interview with a musician promoting the book. And before we started, he said, a lot of writers try to write about musicians and they get it wrong, but you got it right, and I was very surprised.
Oh, you must have
been
thrilled at that.
You really like
that's what you want to hear, right?
You really like to hear that. You want to hear that.
Exactly.
And so I'm proud of that and grateful to all of the musicians who helped.
I don't want our time to slip before we're all waiting with bated breath for the next book. Okay. So where are you in that process, and when might we see that book?
Well, there is some pressure. It is kind, gentle pressure, but there's no pressure.
Nevertheless.
Yeah. Yes. I am working on it as we speak. As soon as I leave you, I'm going home to continue working on it. It's my priority.
Yes.
And it's coming along. I'm feeling good about it. I'm going to try to do something with it that's going to be, I've got to be careful that I actually accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish, because it could either be like, this is fantastic and we love it, or like, this would never happen.
Right.
So my hope is that I will finish a solid draft and take it to my publishers, and hopefully people will be happy with it. And then it's not going to be tomorrow,
right?
But within the next year or so,
exactly.
The next one should be out in the world.
Well, all of us, as I said, we're waiting with bated breath. This has been such a wonderful success, and I can imagine that's a kind of pressure of its own to say, okay, Now what do I do?
You want to, I was just talking to another author whose book, who also had a debut, and he was expressing, I mean, I think it's something that a lot of people don't know. When your book comes out in the world, whatever response you get, positive or negative, really sits with you when you're working on the next one.
Absolutely.
So I'm trying to silence the voices and just stay with the work.
Smart move on your part. And if you had to, I know you don't want to give too much away about this new book because you're in the process. If you had to give us 2 words about what it might be about, could you do that, or you don't want to do that?
An affair.
Oh, now we're really excited. Now we're really
Which is
really
kind of a
excited.
cliche. It's one of the big cliches with fiction, but that's what I mean. I'm trying to do something different with it. So
Well,
I'm hoping I can
that's
pull
the
it off.
challenge that you've
Right.
set for yourself
Right.
as a writer.
One thing that I can say is, as a writer, for whatever reason, I find myself writing about the place that I'm in.
Yes.
You could say that it's easier, but it's also because I'm being fed, I'm being stimulated and intrigued by the place that I'm in. And so Sweet Soft Plenty Rhythm took place in Boston because I was in Boston, but also because I liked the proximity Boston had to New York and sort of the dynamic of circus, having New York and a different future so close. So I finished it, I mean, I revised it and stuff here.
Right.
But it was pretty much finished by the time
Okay.
I got here, and it was just
Okay.
revising it and looking for an agent.
Okay.
But now the book that I'm working on now takes place in LA, and LA is, I mean, I am totally sold on LA. I really love this city. I feel like every type of stimulation a human being needs. I mean, visually, it's so interesting. You have so many different landscapes, obviously. I mean, I'm sounding like a newbie because it still feels so new and fresh to me. But as a writer, there are so many sort of course, there are different people and landscapes and everything else that I've said, but so many different things happening at the same time that are so original to LA
Yes.
that stimulates my writer's mind in a different way, unlike any other place that I've lived. And right now, the characters in the book, they are all from LA. They've all grown up in LA for the most part. The story takes place in LA. And what is challenging, but also fun for me and invigorating for me, is to try to, not being a native, trying to create characters who are from LA and know LA as well as they would, and to, I mean, it's not going to be a character. My friend Eden Lepucky, all of her books take place in LA, and,
Right.
and LA is a character, and you feel it.
Right.
And I am probably not able and not necessarily needing to do that with the book that I'm working on now, but I do want it to feel like this is LA. And so part of that is my own kind of research and experiencing the city in a different way so I can write about it in a way that feels authentic and also illuminates the spice and the darkness and the brightness and all of the complexity of the city and how it shows up in these characters and how it shapes their conflicts. So that's my challenge. So in Sweet Soft Plenty Rhythm, it was, can I represent music in a way that feels authentic when I'm not a musician?
Yes.
And my fear, because I haven't lived in LA as long as I lived in Boston, and LA feels so much bigger and so much more nuanced and intricate. There's so much more happening here
Yes.
than in Boston that I feel like I could live here for the next 25 years and not know it as well as I knew Boston because there's so much.
And you will
Which is part of what's really exciting to me about it. Like, I could live here forever and just like, where am I now? What is this part of town? What's
as a
happening
native
here?
Angelino, I absolutely identify. I'm
Yeah.
still learning
Really?
things about the city.
I'm never
I think
gonna-
I know so well.
Yeah.
But yes, that's what's happened. So you've just made a whole lot of people very, very happy.
I'm going to
and
do my
doubly
best.
excited
Yes.
for this book.
I love this city, so I hope that I represent it well.
Well,
and
we are
it's
just
really
thrilled
feeding me, so
to
I
have you
appreciate it.
here. And we are now claiming you as our own.
Hey, thank
So
you.
thank you.
I appreciate it.
Laura, thank you so much for
Thank
coming
you.
in for this conversation. It's been wonderful, and we're all waiting for the next book.
Thank you so much, Lynn.
Congratulations on this one.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Join us next time for Turn the Page.